Red John killed over 40 people, founded a secret criminal network inside law enforcement, and built an army of devoted followers willing to die for him. But what made him become this way? Today I'm looking deep into Red John's psychology and the actual neuroscience behind his actions. What Red John did the night Patrick Jane insulted him on television is one of the most telling things in the entire show, and it happens early on. Jane called him a sad, lonely soul on live TV. And that same night, Red John drove to his house and murdered his wife and daughter. It took him 2 hours, maybe less. And that is the speed of narcissistic rage in a person with a severely fragile self-concept, and this tells us so much about Red John in the beginning. Narcissistic rage happens when someone with an inflated but brittle sense of self gets publicly humiliated. The brain thinks of this as an existential threat. So then, the prefrontal cortex, the part that handles consequence and impulse control, essentially goes offline. The amygdala, which is a part of your brain that acts like an alarm, takes over in pure threat response mode. That is why the retaliation was both immediate and extreme. Red John had constructed a godlike self-image over years, an artist, a showman, a man elevated above ordinary people. Jane on national television called him sad and lonely, and his brain could not process that as anything less than a total annihilation requiring total annihilation in return. However, the more I looked into Red John, the more disturbing it got. So I had to figure out where he was coming from. Patrick Jane's psychiatrist, Dr. Sophie Miller, met with Red John without knowing it was him. He came to her under a fake name. And even without knowing who he was, she wrote this in her notes that there are hints of a damaged and narcissistic personality, and that there's something deceptive and dark in his emotional makeup. That phrase, damaged and narcissistic, is important. A pure psychopath presents as internally calm, because their brain produces less fear response and less emotional reactivity from the start. But Sophie used the word damage, which also tells us a ton. It suggests someone whose personality did not simply develop without empathy, but developed around a wound, around something that happened and had to be walled off completely. I and many fans wish that we had more lore about Red John, but there just isn't much. We don't know what made him like this, or what kind of childhood or even early life he had, but it must have been very toxic and damaging to the point where he had to become such a monster. Red John's explosive reaction to humiliation, his desperate craving for admiration, his need to frame his violence as a mission, these all point to someone who once felt something, and built an entire identity around making sure he never had to feel it again. But at least we can figure out some parts of him by analyzing his brain further. Most serial killers in fiction fall into what criminologists call the hedonistic category. They kill for pleasure, or for sensation, or for the power of the moment. Red John was something different, and the show actually tells you this if you pay attention. His accomplice, Rebecca Anderson, told Jane that Red John had a mission before she died.
He is a very good man. He's on a mission of love and enlightenment.
Forensic psychology classifies killers who genuinely believe their violence serves a higher purpose as missionary serial killers. Think of how Charles Manson framed his murders as revolutionary truth-telling. The violence was real, but in his own mind he was delivering a message the world needed to hear. Red John operated in the same psychological space. The elaborate crime scenes, the smiley face drawn in the victim's blood, the theatrical staging of every murder as performance art, and so on. All of these are not the behaviors of someone satisfying a basic hunger. These are the behaviors of someone who believes they are communicating something profound to an audience that cannot appreciate it yet. That delusion is one of the most dangerous configurations a predator can have, because it gives the violence a sense of meaning. But how does Red John get these accomplices, or random people, to follow everything he says? One of the coolest details in the show is how Red John recruited his followers. The truth is that it was never random. He targeted people at their lowest, people who were suffering and ashamed, and he appeared in those moments and offered something very specific. He offered the feeling that their darkness was not a flaw, but a strength. Patrick Jane described it exactly when he said to one of Red John's accomplices,
"Everyone you ever met made you feel ashamed, but he didn't. He made you strong. He made you feel proud of that darkness."
Yes, he did.
This is literally trauma bonding, and it works because of how the brain processes rescue experiences. When someone appears during profound vulnerability and offers relief, the emotional system stamps that person as deeply significant. The brain learns this person saved me, and that impression can override almost everything else. Red John understood this so well. He manufactured the conditions for people's breaking. He had Miranda Martins abducted and killed specifically to push Lorelai into a breakdown that he could then appear and rescue her from. That is a calculated understanding of human emotional architecture, and then weaponized. Charismatic predators have been doing this for centuries. Red John was just unusually systematic about it, and what he believed about himself while doing all of this is where it gets genuinely disturbing. Red John named his criminal organization the Blake Association after the English poet and painter William Blake. The passcode was Tiger Tiger, the opening of Blake's most famous poem. He used Blake's paintings of the Great Red Dragon as visual references. His favorite music was Bach's Prelude in C major. You have to know that none of this is random. The aesthetic choices of a killer reveal the identity they are constructing for themselves. Blake's poem The Tiger asks a fundamental theological question: if God made the lamb, who made the tiger? Who made the fearful and the violent? Red John apparently read that and decided he was the answer. Someone with the same creative force that made beauty also had the right to make destruction. In psychology, this is called a grandiose delusional structure, and it is what separates Red John from a regular narcissist. A regular narcissist needs other people to confirm their greatness. Red John built a theological framework for his. He did not need your validation. He had already decided he was operating at the level of a creator, and the crime scenes were his art. That level of grandiosity functions as armor. It makes a person essentially unreachable by guilt or shame, because in their own internal cosmology, what they are doing is not wrong. It is just misunderstood. And the person who came closest to reaching him through all of that armor was Patrick Jane himself. Brett Stiles, which is one of the most perceptive characters in the show, described Red John's fixation on Patrick Jane as a kind of love. Red John and Jane shared an unusual number of traits. Both had rare mentalistic abilities. Both loved Bach and tea. Both were atheists who could construct elaborate multi-step manipulations requiring an almost supernatural ability to model other people's thinking. The show hints that Red John saw Jane not as an adversary, but as a reflection of himself, the version of him broken in a different direction. Lorelai confirmed this later in the show.
After all these years, he's come to see you as an old comrade rather than an enemy.
In neuroscience, this connects to high-functioning social cognition, the ability to build precise mental models of how other people think and feel. Psychopaths understand you with perfect clarity and feel nothing in return. But Red John saved Jane's life twice. He let him get closer than anyone else ever had. He could not bring himself to remove the one person in the world playing the game at his level. Some psychologists would call this pathological attachment, a man with no real relationships producing the closest thing to one that his psychology allowed. The person he was most obsessed with was also the only person capable of actually ending him. So, how did Patrick crack his armor? For 6 seasons, Red John was essentially untouchable. He had accomplices inside the FBI and the CBI. He could predict Jane's moves before Jane made them, and so on. And then a pigeon ended all of it. Thomas McAllister had a genuine phobia of birds, specifically pigeons. When Jane released one in that church, the most calculating criminal mind in the show completely lost control of itself. This is one of the most neuroscientifically accurate moments in the series. Even in people who have heavily suppressed their emotional responses, phobias bypass the rational mind entirely. A phobia is processed in the panic part of the brain before the rational one can intervene. There's no time for the calculating part of the brain to say this is just a bird. Red John spent his entire life building systems of control over followers, over law enforcement, over his own narrative, over Jane, but that moment of panic crushed it all. Jane knew this, and the most powerful villain in the show was taken down because even the most controlled mind still has a limbic system it cannot override, and the system Red John built outside his own head was just as revealing as the one inside it. Red John did not operate alone, which means more than you might think. The Blake Association was a criminal network made up entirely of law enforcement officers. Membership was marked by a tattoo of 3 dots on the left shoulder, and the organization recruited by targeting people with something to hide and making their problems disappear in exchange for loyalty and service. This is how cults and organized crime maintain control. You do not recruit true believers from the start. You recruit people with secrets so that the secret becomes the leash. In psychology, this is called coercive control through compromising information, and it works because it weaponizes shame. Once someone accepts help that required crossing a line, the cost of defecting becomes enormous. Red John built an empire not on genuine loyalty, but on mutually assured destruction. Every member of the Blake Association was holding everyone else's secrets, and at the center of that web was a man who had made himself invisible for decades while serving as a small-town sheriff. And there's just one thing left to cover, and I think it's more fascinating than you might realize. So let's talk about it. The smiley face is the detail everyone remembers about Red John, and it is also the most psychologically dense thing he did. He drew it with 3 fingers in the victim's blood, always clockwise and always positioned, so it was the first thing you saw when you entered the room. Jane explained this exactly.
He has a strong sense of theater. He made sure that the first thing that anyone sees is the face on the wall. You see the face first, and you know. You know what's happened, and you feel dread. Then, and only then, do you see the body of the victim.
The smiley face is a mechanism for controlling your emotional experience of the crime scene itself. Sadistic psychology is the need to control how other people feel. Red John forced every investigator, every witness to experience dread on his terms, scripting their emotional sequence from beyond the scene itself. Neuroscience has a concept for this, and it's called theory of mind, which is the ability to model what another person is experiencing internally. Most people use it for empathy, but Red John used it to engineer maximum psychological impact. The crying smiley face, looking like it weeps because the blood runs before it dries, was not an accident. It was made by a man who convinced himself he was an artist operating at the level of a god while drowning in a wound he had never once looked at directly. So, Thomas McAllister was not a monster in the sense you might have think of. He was just a damaged man who built an entire psychological system around never having to feel small again, and that system ended up destroying dozens of lives and nearly destroyed Patrick Janes completely. This is why I think the season 6 reveal wasn't so bad after all. Tell me what you think, and thank you for the support. I'll catch you guys in the next video.